Hi, everyone. Welcome back into the room. If we can just turn on your video, give me a wave so I know that you're not all on tea break. Hello, humans. Hello, humans. Hi. Hi. Thank you. We are going to move on to our next session. These wonderful Mojo films. Sorry, we had to cut the last one short, but we will be sharing them. You will be receiving our hot soup mailers that have been going out screening all of these, and you'll continue to see a lot of these films being screened in the breaks throughout the conference. So next up today, we have a very important part of our time together. We're on to our collective learnings, hub level synthesis and discussion. We're going to be hearing from two hubs today. We're going to be hearing from India, from Poonam and Amir, and then we're going to be hearing from Rwanda, from Michael and Dan. The format of today's session is each hub is going to take only 35 minutes to present, 20 minutes presentation followed by 15 minutes discussion with you, the network. And we're going to be running a poll in there as well. So without further ado, I invite Poonam and Amir to take the floor. I'm going to be screen sharing your slides. Is that correct? Oh, no, that's Rwanda. You're going to be screen sharing your slides. Is that correct, Poonam?
Okay, great. I'll do that. Yes.
Welcome.
Does it look okay? Everybody can see? Okay. So let me begin. This is a very difficult task of synthesizing 23 TESF India research and intervention projects. But let me try and begin the presentation with a little background, and then Amir will also take over in between, and then we will conclude. So we started with basic research questions, which are some of the key questions are here before you. How is social, gender, economic, environmental, and epistemic injustice sustained and perpetuated in and through education? How does educational inequality intersects with other inequalities and impacts the most disadvantaged, including the urban margins? How does educational inequality impede the realization of the full potential of education in enabling social and environmental justice? How can education be transformed to develop critical knowledges, capacities, teacher and student agency towards developing socially and environmentally just societies? And how can indigenous and local knowledges and interdisciplinary knowledges and frames be operationalized in teaching learning environments? These were the key research questions of the 23 projects that explored the dynamic relationship between education and sustainable futures. So it was important to look at the framing of sustainable development itself, beginning with what the foundation paper tells us. We had a project within the 23 that actually questions this. Even though we begin with the understanding that sustainable development is a critical application of ideas of sustainability to local contexts, we find that most of these approaches that have tried to refine the idea continue to operate within a dominant frame, which is really that of economic self-interest of some of the regions and some people over others. And this is despite inclusivity and attempts to address diversity. So questioning this dominant frame of development is Yamuna Sunny's project, where she argues that the close association between capital, trade, and the development of environmental regimes in the neoliberal era, on the one hand, and the appropriation of sustainability logic by international actors on the other, necessitate that we critically examine the notion of sustainable development. And we find that market-based policies have certainly led to increased economic growth, but they do not address social, ecological, economic sustainability. And this prompts us to revisit the sustainable development as a construct and as practice. we do have decolonizing knowledges and attempts to expand the idea of development, and diverse worldviews of the colonized, of the marginalized, have actually been foregrounded. But these also compel us to address conceptual contradictions within the frame of development. For example, we do know that while there is mainstream modernity, development, economic growth narrative, there is also livelihood loss, deepening inequalities, and ecological degradation. So let's learn from communities who are really outside the ambit of development. And this is what one of the projects does, where the question, which is larger, of sustainability is not that of only protecting forests and ecologies in which people live, but of listening to their voices. And co-creating knowledge with Indigenous communities led to examine the nuances of ecological and social relationships in tribal societies. And the word tribal has been put in inverted commas to indicate that it is a system which is both social and connected with nature. It isn't something that can be subsumed under a generic term, indigenous communities alone. But these communities, actually for them, individual competition for capital is not the fulcrum of development. And therefore the question, whose knowledge? Co-creating knowledge with the Bharia community, and we heard Yamuna talk about that, found that the school actually creates alienation for children because there is a narrow range of selective knowledge that they're exposed to. And this is a pedagogic as well as a knowledge representation challenge. The study clearly shows how education seems to be working exclusively to legitimize a particular kind of development. And therefore, alienating the Adivasi, the tribal school child, is what we find in other projects as well, where the ethos of the school is based on teachers as well as peer discrimination. Textbooks depict Adivasi communities in very stereotypical ways, and the school assessment program also is one where a culture of competition is encouraged, which is completely dissonant with the Adivasi values of unity and cooperation. So the question is, do we have an Adivasi worldview that helps us to revisit the meanings and purposes of education? There is a very interesting observation in this project which talks of tribal cultural norms and economic practices that actually include ideas of collective ownership and harvesting sustainably. And this is in the frame of long-term cohabitation. Their idea of education of their children is that children must be able to navigate their home worlds as well as the knowledge of the modern world, but with dignity and character so that they can lead the values, the lives that they value. They wish to reclaim village as a site so that there is abstract academic knowledge alongside traditional Adivasi knowledge forms. This serves to strengthen relationships across generations, including building youth leaderships. There are projects then that look at epistemes and learning, trying to problematize these frames. School textbooks, for example, have a utilitarian, anthropocentric approach to forests and wildlife conservation, where forests are a resource and extractive practices are talked about for human welfare. Decontextualized from local milieu and the lived experiences, these texts do not allow students to observe and to problematize local questions. For instance, texts emphasize physical and scientific aspects of water, but they're silent on water history or water sources that are deeply linked to unequal power equations within the society across gender, caste, community. The question, therefore, is that do these texts really aid in building interdisciplinary viewpoints? And the observation is that they don't. So there is also an attempt within some of the projects to expand the frames of epistemes. For example, a project argues that the dissonance that is there between the textbook knowledge and children's lived experiences could be actually dealt with by focusing on the everyday. The everyday creates fissures in the normative understanding of community, of identity and belonging, and therefore allows us to deconstruct stereotypes. It opens up possibilities of understanding intersectionality, between class, caste, religion, region, gender. This is a project that was done and looked at citizenship from a children's viewpoint, from a child lens. There's another project that really beautifully brings out the caste-based inequalities and how the privileged of our society look at it. Clearly, the privileged sections do not even see caste as relevant to their lives because they themselves see themselves as casteless. So engaging with caste, which is really a hierarchical social system in Indian society, they find that the privileged were able to, through collective reading of Dalit biographies, Dalit is those of the lower caste, their biographies actually gave entry points for engaging with the caste question. And a very, very telling comment of one of the participants is that I had never imagined, even looking at caste as a part of my life. But when I was emboldened to extend this experience to a group of family and friends, I find that the journey to face caste is very discomforting. By not undertaking it, we actually live a lifelong lie. There's also an interesting project that looks at the gender spectrum from the viewpoint of gender non-conforming, gender non-binary persons in the Indian science ecosystem. And what is found is that there is not only a gendered nature of science institutions in the higher education specifically, but the curricula and the epistemological discourse is discriminatory, and it constantly erases the trans identity. Another project finds in examining first generation higher education learners from families of stigmatized occupations, how difficult the process of accessing curriculum, comprehending curriculum in higher education is. And the interesting insight is that they still do not look at it as institutional failure, but they see it as individual failure. So what the conclusion is that the occupational stigma is embodied and it intersects with caste, gender, and other identities. A project with low fee paying private school teachers reveals that their labor is reproduced and is denied the status of real work. In fact, teaching for many of these women teachers in these schools is found to be an extension of socially expected roles of performing a seva, which is service, but towards a caste society and in a caste society. So the real argument is that teachers' work is devalued within the intersectional frames of caste Hindu notions of seva, service, and Brahmanical notions of ideal womanhood, which are still very strong in India today, and Western formulations of professionalism. So any Western formulations and concepts do not help us to break this nexus. It only makes it more rigid and further aggravating. But we have a silver lining. We have several projects giving us a glimpse of transformative practices in higher education. For example, we find that when we are able to present a connection between individual biographies and socio-political histories, it really empowers young people. And it enables the unlearning of privilege without shame. Dialogue-based pedagogy is used to engage student teachers also with patriarchal norms. And this is seen as a political act. The intervention creates empathy. In teacher education, we find that there is a way to disrupt the traditional classroom and break the culture of silence by turning the lens from the study of the other to the study of the self. And theater is certainly something that brings to us, it is not only a political act, but a transformative process, enabling to help us to witness the way we are and acting from that space of clarity. The pedagogic engagement with privileged students as researchers also reveal the journey of developing critical empathy. And I will come back to that a little later. I'd leave it to Amir to address the section on education and the urban.
Yes, urban is a very interesting site, equally important for both Africa and Asia. And one of the things that we are trying to look at is how do we problematize education in and for the urban? And there were a few projects that kind of examined this question. And one of the important things that emerged was that maybe previous slide, this is slide, no, yeah, exactly. So education is like, it's challenging in the urban context, and it's definitely not the pathway to economic or social mobility, or in a sense, to be a claim onto the city. And there are complex processes that's limiting the role of education, and even the market-facing skills, etc. Where 80% of the urban livelihoods they are in the informal sector. So education is not empowering, and some of the peculiarities of a particular urban domain is also not recognized. For example, the northeastern part of the country. Next slide. So one of the interesting insights that emerged from some of the projects was that can we kind of develop an epistemic and practice-based repository. So we have a project on food that documents what is possible. We also have a project around water, which helps us understand and develop skills, perspectives, and reflexivity needed towards understanding a particular resource. Next slide. And so is there a possibility to address urban sustainability through education? Yes. The project on professional education helps us that look, there are structural constraints, but there are certain pedagogic, curricular, and policy strategies that can be adopted. We can invert the process by making research accessible to marginalized youth and help them learn, build critical capacities, and look at city as the learning lab. And then we can develop pedagogies that link research, training, and public engagement to look at questions of sustainability. Next slide. Yeah, over to Poonam.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. I will just quickly, I know there are very few minutes left. Basically, 3 slides here. Firstly, that projects capture a range of structures, implicit and explicit processes that have prevailed in Indian society over generations, and these have favored the privileged and certainly intensified by India's economic modernity development narrative. The formal spaces and structures are impermeable and ineffective in altering any equations of hierarchy and power. Formal education, in fact, sustains and reinforces these inequalities, camouflaging the magnitude of the problem. But social and environmental justice are clearly intertwined, but they are seen as disconnected. The question, therefore, is, can we reset priorities to transform education? Educators, for instance, need to recognize, reevaluate, and alter the way their own epistemic, ontological, pedagogical context and assumptions that they bring when they teach diverse communities. Transformative pedagogies must seek to turn the lens from the study of the other to the study of the self and engage with structural nature of inequalities, including patriarchy and caste, and its nexus with the free market. Theater and the arts give us many such openings when it allows people to speak about their vulnerabilities. But let me say here, vulnerabilities does bring an entry point for transformative processes of learning. But adopting these egalitarian and dialogical methods of learning, where we include the marginalized, is only part of the transformative story. The real story is when pedagogies enable privileged educators to find ways to acknowledge and accept their role in sustaining caste, gender, and socioeconomic inequalities. Learning more about caste, for instance, can result in denial, guilt, and shame, and these create barriers to change. Transcending this involves what a project tells us is developing critical empathy and ethics of care. This journey of developing critical empathy involves confrontation, reflection, and visceral knowing of structural nexus complicity, and the self. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't exceeded my time, and we can now move to, I will have to stop sharing my screen. Just give me a second. I don't know why I have got stuck.
Thank you so much, Poonam and Amir, for your wonderful, deep thought and insight that has gone in over many, many months. We're still part of the session here, but what we're going to move into now is a space for the next 15 minutes for Poonam and Amir to answer questions from the audience. But first, we're going to actually run a long answer poll. So I'm going to pop the poll on the screen, and you'll be able to respond in paragraph form. So please, as you see it on there, would love to see your responses. Poonam and Amir will gather these after the conference, and we'll may not be able to respond to everything during today's session, but it's a space to capture your thoughts. So first question, what are the top 3 things that sparked, yes, we found that too? Second question is, which 3 things do you feel, no, that doesn't really apply to our project? And lastly, what would you like to add based on your project experiences?
Okay, so I take over, right? Amir
Yes.
and me. Okay. Amir, would you like to start?
Well, I mean, thank you for saying good things about the presentation, and thank you for keenly listening. And of course, we had a range of things to talk about and of course, the 23 projects deserve real applause for putting in their sweat and toil and doing some fantastic work, new research, new ways of engaging with research questions and coming up with something that we work together and brought and put it into a framework. So they deserve a lot of accolades, and this is an opportunity to thank them as well. I think I don't know how to engage. One of the things that has always fascinated me and Poonam is interrogating the ideas of sustainable development, and this is what we started with also. And if you recall Poonam's presentation, there's some
here are the
content
yes
coming, features, worldviews.
We'll probably have to, yes, we'll have to look at this closely.
Yeah.
I hope we can look at this. There's a lot that has come in. I'd really like to look at this closely and perhaps also see if we can incorporate some of the comments in the final synthesis work that we will do. Shall we invite, since we have very little time, invite questions and comments from the audience?
Yeah.
Any questions? Anything that you'd like to tell us?
Daniel.
We've heard good things, but do be brutal and let us know. Yeah. Yes, Daniel and Hyla.
Hello, everybody. Firstly, thank you so much for sharing and the reflections that came forward. I find it quite enriching. I suppose I also have a lot more reading to do because I think that's the nature of these events. But I just want to check in. So in South Africa, we don't necessarily have, or we've not necessarily had the caste system, but we've had apartheid and, you know, racial segregation, and that's now led into where we stand and find ourselves. I mean, at the end of your presentation, you vocalized that diving into topics like the caste, and the more you learn, the more uncomfortable and resistant you become. How did that show up in ways that you've moved forward in this project? I mean, here in South Africa, the kind of challenge of the kind of continuation of apartheid and the systemic issues have definitely found us, or we've definitely found it to be quite halting in our unpacking of knowledge and transforming education. But I'm curious to know how one doesn't become too limited by systemic injustice in the process and in the kind of build to transforming education. Yeah, thank you for that.
Shall I respond to this, or shall we take a couple of other questions? We have very little time. Rosie?
If you'd like, we can take Hayla's question and then we'll pause for the response, and then we can take Patrick's question.
Thank you. Thank you so
thank you
much.
very much.
Oh, sorry, Patrick, you're...
Thank you for the...
Hi, Patrick. Sorry, you're actually next. We're going to get Taylor's question and then they're going to respond, and then we're going to go to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry, Shane. Patrick could have gone. I just want to say thank you very much to Poonam and Amir and the India team for that presentation. You know, what struck me as I was listening to you was just the, if I could call it, the deep-seated connections around the aftermath and the fallout and the conundrums that have been produced by colonial modernity. I think you phrased it so nicely at one point. And the deep legacies that are sort of sitting there for all of us. And for me, it felt like, you know, wow, this is something that it would be really useful to reflect on across the contexts, because it feels to me that they, you know, when I was trying to answer the question, you know, what is not relevant to my context, I actually couldn't find anything in what you'd said, because pretty much everything is just so resonant here, as Gabriel was also beginning to ask a question around. So for me, that was very important insight. Of course, we sort of know that, but to see it coming through so beautifully is very interesting, I think. So thank you. I just wanted to mention that.
Poonam, would you like to respond to the first two, and then we'll move on to Patrick? Sorry about that, Patrick. We'll come back to you.
Yes, I wish we had more time, but very quickly, my response would be that what I was trying to say is, I mean, certainly, I think there's so much of resonance. In fact, I remember when in 1994, when South Africa was actually able to end apartheid, it was almost like we were at the beginning of the time when India became independent. I mean, literally, that was the feeling we had for you. And we felt there was so much common. I mean, there's race and there's caste here. But of course, the question of, facing caste comes from two specific projects, specifically among the privileged. And I think what insights that have emerged, one is from actually a project where library educators were engaged with on Dalit biographies and reading caste, and amongst the privileged, how they look at it. The other was from a set of researchers who participated in the project that worked on first generation learners from stigmatized occupation families. And it seems that the privileged seems to think that there is no caste really, and that we have achieved a casteless society. But to enable us to face that as it's like an entry point into imagining transformative pedagogies, not for the privileged, but for everyone really, because it's a question of not resistance to it. It's a question of breaking a nexus. And I would repeat here, it's a nexus between the kind of systemic frames that we work in, whether it's the free market economy, whether it's the whole baggage of modernity, which is only sort of being enhanced and augmented with the kind of oligarchs we have today, and the transnational way of sort of looking at these nexus, and the Brahmanical notions, which are so deep-rooted within Indian society. And that comes out even in the research with teachers, for example. And I think that is an important aspect. Unless we, the privileged, are able to confront this and actually accept our complicity in maintaining a status quo of a certain kind, I'm not sure whether we can work. We'll be continually talking at the vulnerable, but not really with them to enable deep-rooted change. That's the way I would look at it.
Thanks, Poonam. We have time for 2 last questions. Patrick, if you'd like to ask a short question, and then we have Kerry who posted one in the chat, I believe. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you very much for that nice presentation. Now, my question is, among the privileged who are seeing this and they want to bring change, how will they champion this change to have a cashless education? Yeah, you interacted with them. What are they thinking? What actions should they take to bring this change, so that people don't believe that they should be privileged to have education? For them, they are from privileged class. They have seen that it is not relevant. Everybody should have this education. So now, what action are they taking? How are they going to champion this change? Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Patrick.
I think this is not really a question where we can answer through from an individual viewpoint. There is a systemic nexus, the politics, the economics of it, the whole socio-cultural sort of nexus along with that. It's a much deeper question. And the challenge, what we have been able to develop as insight is that there is a possibility here. The possibility of bringing resistance pedagogies, the possibility of creating and giving a voice which can actually be heard in the corridors of power.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks. And I think we have time for Helen's last question. Helen, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'm sorry I thought my camera's not working. I guess I just wanted to, it's really to push you a little further on the same lines as, I don't know whether it was Gabriel or Daniel who actually asked the question about, I mean, to play devil's advocate as a sort of counterfactual, one can imagine a particular Hindutva ideologue claiming, for example, that, maintaining caste where, you have different communities variously doing their farming, protecting ecological diversity, sweeping up and so forth, could be an ecologically very sound way of proceeding. I mean, of course, I'm not saying I advocate that, but we know about inequality and structural inequality. What are the implications of these findings that just show how deeply entrenched it is in terms of then trying to look more at sustainable futures, and what potentially you'd be advocating, if I could suggest anything less than a fundamental radical transformation, which realistically is probably not going to happen in the very near future?
Yeah, I think, I couldn't agree with you more. It's a very hard battle to be able to move even the discourse on structural inequalities. For example, even the SDGs sort of framework is a normative frame. And I find educational inequality missing from the list of SDG goals. And to my mind, a lot of the structural inequalities are reinforced, sustained in and through education. So education does have a space and a role to play, but we're always sort of, juggling between education as a space of continuing the status quo and entrenching it further and being able to create. Therefore, the question is that education alone cannot do this. And I think interventions towards sustainable futures would have to be at multiple levels, probably in almost all the areas where we find inequality and injustice, including political representation or social, epistemic injustice and justice, for example. So it has to be on multiple fronts. And I do not see this battle having won easily, except that these researches do show us that there is a way to first problematize the situation and the issues rather than jump at solutions with half-baked understanding of what is on the ground.
Thank you. Great answer.
Thank you so much, Poonam. Thank you so much, Amir. We've come to the end of this session. I know that there's still a lot to reflect on from the polls. I've actually managed to download it and I've already posted it in the chat, so it's there for everyone to scroll through as well. We just want to give a big round of applause to Poonam and Amir. They will be reflecting on some of the questions.
Thank
And
you.
we'll be hearing.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks. It's nice to turn on the videos just to give them a round of applause. It really is nice to see everyone's faces. Wow. Excellent. Next, and just also a huge thank you to Poonam and Amir from India, who presented